Hello everybody and welcome to a new video on the Mirror Lessons channel, and in this episode we're going to talk about the Fujifilm X-T4. And I bought the X-T4 around May when it was made available to the public, and I compared it to the X-T3 before selling my X-T3, and I know I'm a bit late, but I can finally share my full review with you guys. As usual, you will find a written version, a text version of this video on our website mirrorlesscomparison.com, and I'll leave the link in the cards or in the description below. And this video is going to be a bit long because it's a full review and there's lots of things to talk about. So if you want to jump to a specific section, just use the chapters at the bottom or in the description. Let's get started. Here we have the Fujifilm X-T4. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the X-T3 with me anymore to show them side by side, but I can show you some images that I took earlier. As you can see, they look very much alike when it comes to design, dimensions, ergonomics, and also dials and buttons are very similar. The X-T4 is slightly larger and thicker than the X-T3. This is to accommodate the larger battery and the image stabilization unit inside the body. So overall, Fuji did a good job in keeping this increase in size as subtle as possible. So let's have a closer look at what has changed on the X-T4. So first of all, the grip is a bit larger, and it's still not large enough with big lenses like the 100 to 400mm, but with small and medium size lenses, it's fine. On the rear, they added a locking mechanism for the eye cap so that you won't dislodge it inadvertently. If I can put it back, there we go. And some buttons have swapped position, like for example the AEL button and the Q button. The biggest change is the sub-dial under the shutter speed dial that doesn't control metering anymore like on the X-T3, but allows you to switch from still to video mode, which is very handy for hybrid shooters. The AF on button is larger and more rounded, so easy to reach and press. And the rear command dial now sticks out more on the outside, so it's easier to turn. For the rest, it's the same layout as the X-T3, which is a very good thing. So you have lots of dials to control the exposure, like the ISO dial and the shutter speed dial. And there's the exposure compensation dial, which is a bit difficult to turn with just one finger. I guess they designed this way to prevent you from accidentally turning while using the camera, whereas the other two dials can be locked and unlocked with the central buttons. On the rear, there is an AF joystick, which is precise to use, although if I have to nitpick, I would say it's a bit small, and all the other buttons are basically the same as the X-T3. And of course, the X-T4, like the X-T3, is fully weather sealed. The X-T3 has this unusual three-way tilting mechanism. In addition to tilting up and down, it can be oriented by about 70 degrees on the side, which is useful when working in vertical orientation. On the X-T4, Fujifilm decided to implement a multi-angle LCD screen, probably to appeal video makers a bit more. And one of the advantages that you can rotate it 180 degrees if you want to film yourself or vlogging or the things like that. And I know many people prefer this solution, but personally, if I were only to shoot photos, I would prefer the solution of the X-T3 because at least the screen doesn't stick out on the side like this. But of course, it's up to personal preferences. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that if you have cables connected on the side of the camera, they're going in the way of the LCD screen, so you have to move it a little bit like this in order to rotate it. The screen has more resolution in comparison to the X-T3. It's now 1.62 million dots. It is touch sensitive and you can do a lot of different things with it. You can take a shot, you can move the AF point, you can flick in 4 different directions to activate some function, and you can even change settings in the Q menu. It's not always very reactive, and depending on the function, you may need to press hard like here for the Q menu. I find the LCD screens on Canon and Nikon cameras to be better, for example, and with those you can also navigate the menu, something you cannot do on the X-T4. One thing you can do is to use the touchscreen to move the AF point while you're composing with EVF, but I personally prefer to use the AF joystick. And speaking of the EVF, it's the same as the X-T3, which is a very good one. It's bright, it's sharp, it has a resolution of 3.69 million dots, and the refresh rate goes up to 100 frames per second when the boost mode is activated. If, like me, you wear glasses, you won't see the extreme corners, but I don't find this to be a problem. Concerning physical connection, we have a 3.5mm jack for audio, for microphones, and then a 2.5mm jack for remote control. And here we have the micro HDMI and the USB-C type port. And here you also have a flash sync port. Unlike the X-T3, there is no headphone output. Instead, Fuji gives you this USB-C to MIDI jack adapter. And so you just connect it to the USB-C port of the camera, and there is your headphone output. However, this means that you cannot use the USB-C port for something else, like for example a power bank. Then we have two SD card slots. They're both compatible with UHS 2, and the X-T4 can record 4K video on the two cards simultaneously, which is something that its predecessor, the X-T3, cannot do. Finally, we have the battery, and it's a new battery, especially designed for the X-T3. It's the NPW235, and as you can see, it is larger than the previous battery, which is the NPW126S. And just to give you an idea, when I tested the X-T4 for birds in flight, I took more than 4,000 images. I also recorded a few clips in 4K 50p and a few in Full HD at 240 frames per second. And after 3 hours of work, the battery icon on the LCD screen showed 2 bars left out of 5. So pretty good performance overall. With the X-T3, I would have to swap batteries at least once. Then I put the two cameras side by side and recorded some 4K video at 50 frames per second. And the X-T3 managed to record 58 minutes, so that's almost 3 clips of 20 minutes each before the battery ran out, whereas the X-T4 gave me an extra half an hour. So overall, an excellent improvement on the X-T4 with the new battery. The menu system is the same as the X-T3, and I find it easier to navigate. It's well organized in 5 main sections, and there is the option on My Menu where you can save your favorite settings. What's new on the X-T4 is that when you switch from still to video mode, the menu changes as well, so you only have the settings that are related to the mode you're using, which is clever. Also, most of the settings you configure in video mode, for example the color profile or the saturation, won't affect the photography mode and vice versa. Another thing is Movie Optimized Control, which allows you to adjust the exposure with the command dial or the touchscreen. And this way you can keep different exposure settings separate between still and movie mode, so when you go back and forth between the two, you don't have to change the exposure all over again. On the X-T3 you can do something similar with a function called Movie Silent Control, but you can only do it via the touchscreen. There are 10 function buttons, which is one more than what you find on the X-T3. The front dial can have up to 3 different settings, for example aperture, ISO and exposure compensation, and you press it to toggle between the 3 options. Finally, we have the Q button that accesses the quick menu. What's new here is that you can reduce the amount of blocks, the amount of settings that appear on screen. The maximum and default number is 16, but you can reduce it to 12, 8 or 4 if you don't need to access too many parameters. And this can also be configured separately for still and video. The X-T4 uses the same sensor as its predecessor, the X-T3, and also the X-Pro 3 and the X-T30. It's the 4th generation X-Trans APS-C sensor with 26.1 megapixel, and it has a back illuminated structure. The camera has the same X-Processor Pro engine as well. I did some basic side-by-side tests for the sake of it, just to see if there would be any difference with things like dynamic range between the X-T3 and the X-T4, and surprisingly, there are none. Of course, it's the same image quality. And I can show you how flexible the RAW files are. The first image is overexposed for the scene outside the window. If I recover the part on the inside, this is what you get with a 4-stop recovery. And if we zoom in on the image, you can see that there is noise, but it's not too bad and it can get better with a bit of noise reduction applied to it. The second example is 2-stop brighter than the first image. If I try to recover highlights, this is what I'm able to retrieve, which is decent, but as usual, digital sensors are stronger in the shadows than in the highlights. But overall, I think it's a very good sensor when it comes to dynamic range. The ISO range goes from 160 to 12,800, and if you use the extended value, then you can go down to ISO 80 or up to ISO 51,200. Here as well, no surprises, the quality is the same as the X-T3 because the sensors are the same, and this is what you can expect when it comes to high ISO performance. The quality is really good up to about 3200 ISO. From 6400 you start to see more noise, and 12800 is the maximum I would go to. If you're desperate, 25600 is still usable somehow, but the last value is really too grainy. When shooting RAW you can choose different compression levels. and the X-T4 has a new option called compressed, in addition to lossless compress and uncompressed. I did a quick dynamic range test to see if the compressed version would lose some information when recovering the shadows intensely, but as you can see, very little changes. What is a bit surprising is that the difference with file size between compress and lossless compress is almost non-existent. So I don't really see the advantage of using compress in terms of saving space or clearing the buffer more quickly. Lossless does fine and is certainly smaller than uncompressed. To find differences between the X-T3 and the X-T4, we need to look at the image quality settings for the straight-out camera JPEGs, and starting with the film simulation mode, which is how Fujifilm calls the picture profiles on its cameras. The X-T3 has 10 of these profiles, but the X-T4 has 2 extra ones: Classic Neg, which was introduced on the X Pro 3, and Eternal Bleach Bypass. Classic Neg is modeled on the superior negative film, and along with Bleach Bypass, is one of the most distinctive look Fujifilm has developed. It has a similar contrast to classic chrome, but with more saturation and different color hues and tints. If we look at this example, it makes the image look less natural in terms of colors, especially if you pay attention to the green in the foreground and background, and the jacket is pink in real life, not red. But it's an interesting look. I wouldn't use it every time, but I appreciate Fujifilm's efforts in bringing such a variety of unique color profiles to its cameras. Eternal Bleach Bypass reduces saturation and increases contrast. It's not my favorite look, but I'm sure it can work for certain projects. The beauty of Fuji cameras is that you can vary a lot of settings to customize these film simulation modes. You have things such as grain effect, dynamic range, tone curve, which used to be called highlights and shadows on the X-T3, color, sharpness, and even a new setting called clarity. Same reasoning applies for monochrome images, and you can get very nice black and white photos in camera. There is also the monochromatic color option that allows you to give a color tint to your monochrome image, and the X-T4 version is more advanced than the X-T3 setting. It can take a bit of time to find the right combination that can please your eyes, but a good tip is to connect your camera to the computer with USB cable and use the Fujifilm X-RAW Studio software, because the latter uses the camera's image processor to develop the RAW files, so you get exactly the same result as you were doing in camera. You can of course process RAW files on the X-T4 if you want, but it's a bit quicker on the computer. You also have a setting called Chrome Effect, and the X-T4 has a new variant for blue. The normal Chrome Effect, which is also available on the X-T3, makes the reds deeper with more shades and details. The Color Chrome Effects Blue does the same thing but with shades of blue in your photo. Finally, the X-T4 has an HDR mode that you can access from the drive dial here. The camera blends 3 images together and gives you more details in the highlights and shadows. You can choose 5 options: Auto, 200%, 400%, 800% and 800% plus. The higher the value, the more extreme the effect becomes because the gap in stops between the shots is higher. From 200% to 800%, the camera will preserve more highlights information, but the shadows remain more or less the same. It is only with the 800% plus that you also get brighter shadows. The X-T4 attempts to correct alignment between the 3 images and also correct motion to avoid artifacts or unwanted ghost effects if something is moving in your scene. With elements like water and the sea, it looks okay. If your subject doesn't move a lot, it works fine, so for example you can use it for portraits if you want. However, with faster moving subjects like a car, you're going to get a ghost effect. Another thing I've noticed is a loss of sharpness when using the HDR mode. You can use the sharpness and clarity settings to correct this. It won't be as sharp as the normal photo mode, but it's better than not doing anything at all. The HDR mode is effective for JPEGs only, but if you also record RAW files while using this function, you can use the in-camera RAW processor to create the HDR JPEG file afterwards, so after taking the shot. You can only do it up to 800%, the 800% plus is not available. If I look at the size of the RAW files, the ones taken with the HDR mode are bigger. However, if I take these larger RAW files and open them in Lightroom, they just behave like normal files. They don't have more dynamic range. So I guess when using the HDR mode, the camera saves extra information in the RAW files to allow you to recreate the JPEGs, the HDR JPEGs later in playback mode, but there is no way to use that extra information for the RAW file itself. If you're curious to know more about the HDR mode of the X-T4, which is also available on the X Pro 3 and the X100V, you can check our dedicated article on mirrorscomparison.com, and as usual, the links is in the cards or in the description below. There isn't a lot that has changed on the X-T4 in comparison to the X-T3. Most of the video specs are the same, so let's have a look at them. It can record 4K up to 60 frames per second, albeit with a 1.8 times sensor crop. Up to 30p there is no crop, so it uses the entire width of the sensor. It can record up to 400 megabits per second with the all-intra compression, although that is not available at the 50 or 60 frames per second, so you have to use long GOP compression instead. You can record 10-bit internally with the H.265 codec and 10-bit 422 via the HDMI output, and that works at all frame rates. And finally, the recording limit per clip is 30 minutes up to 30p and 20 minutes at 50 or 60p. Since I mentioned sensor crop, this is how it looks when recording up to 30p. The entire width of the sensor is used. This image was shot with a 35mm lens, so this is 50mm equivalent. And if you switch to 50 or 60 frames per second, this is the crop the camera applies, so your field of view becomes similar to 60mm equivalent. In both modes, the camera uses all the pixels available, which is known as full pixel readout or oversampling, so the sharpness output is really good in 4K at every frame rate. The video quality is the same as the X-T3, which is very good, and it means that X-T4 is as capable of producing very good footage in 4K. And all the settings I showed you previously for photography, things like film simulations, sharpness, and other things, are also available in video mode. The only thing you won't be able to use is the HDR mode or the chrome effect, but all the other settings are available, so you can get very nice colors straight off the camera with X-T4. These profiles work well with skin tones, but when using manual white balance, you can get a bit of green dominance, which is more or less visible depending on the profile used. That is something you can fix in post or in camera by using the white balance shift adjustment, and by the way, this is also valid for straight out of camera JPEGs in still photography mode. There are some profiles that are designed specifically for video. The first is called Eterna, which is a bit low in saturation and contrast, so you can tweak those in post. The latitude is really good and it has an interesting color palette. If you want more advanced color grading in post, you can use the HLG or F-Log profiles that will give you as much as dynamic range as possible. With F-Log, the minimum ISO available is 640, whereas with HLG it doesn't go lower than 1000 ISO, which can be a bit problematic when shooting outdoor during the day. The image will be very low in contrast, so you need to apply a LUT or color grading manually in post, but that's the best way to get more information in the highlights or shadows, and the quality is really good. What's new on the X-T4 is that now you have a F-Log View Assist, which allows you to see the normal contrast and saturation on the screen rather than a flat image. There is another way to get more dynamic range without having to use the HLG or F-Log profile, and that is to use the dynamic range setting. What happens is that the camera underexposes the image to preserve more highlight information and opens the shadow to increase the latitude. There are two levels. DR 200% works from ISO 320 and DR 400% works from ISO 640. And let me show you how it works. So here we have a shot recorded with Eterna at ISO 160, which is the base level, and as you can see there's a lot of contrast between the interior and the exterior. If I activate the DR 400% setting, my exposure obviously goes up because of the change in ISO. I can see more details in the shadows, but the highlights remain more or less the same. And if I then decide to close the aperture by one stop, I recover most of the highlights information outside while still having brighter shadows than my initial shot. The ISO range is the same we saw for still photography, but you don't have the extended low value of ISO 80, and the extended high values stops at 25x600. For the rest, it performs well here too. Very contained noise up to 3200 ISO, with 6400 and 12800 still usable. There is also a noise reduction setting that allows you to control the amount of noise. Just keep in mind that if you set it too high, you lose a bit of sharpness. Personally, I always leave it to 0. Rolling shutter is contained with moderate speed, but if you're panning very quickly with the camera, you will get some distortion. The camera can record in Full HD up to 60 frames per second, And the quality, although not as sharp as 4K for obvious reasons, still remains very good. But one difference in comparison to the X-T3 is the slow motion capabilities, because the X-T4 can record up to 240 frames per second, whereas the X-T3 stops at 120 frames per second. I'm not going too in-depth about the slow motion capabilities of the X-T4 because we have a dedicated video on our YouTube channel, so I'll leave the links in the cards or in the description below. The bottom line is 240 frames per second is really cool for slow motion, but there is a visible loss of quality in comparison to 120 frames per second or slower frame rates in Full HD. You have to deal with aliasing, sometimes you have to deal with moire, and overall there is a big loss of sharpness. Also, the sensor is cropped by 1.29 times when using the slow motion function. But apart from this, most of the settings remain available, including the continuous autofocus. The last thing I want to mention is overheating. So when I was testing the battery life of the two cameras, recording 4K up to 50p side by side, the X-T4 started to show the overheat symbol on the LCD screen after about 50 minutes. Shortly after 1 hour, the X-T4 shut down, and the room temperature was about 24 degrees Celsius. The X-T3, on the other hand, while feeling almost as warm as the X-T4, never shut down even after 2 hours. For the X-T4, I waited about 5 minutes, then I turned it back on and it was able to record again. I'm not sure why this difference. I can guess is because the X-T4 has an internal structure that is different, because it has the image stabilization unit, for example, so perhaps the heat dissipation is not as efficient as the X-T3. But I wouldn't panic about this because the camera stopped after 1 hour, it didn't stop after 10 minutes or 20 minutes or even 30 minutes, so it's not as bad as some other cameras we heard about lately, and I'll let you guess which one I'm talking about. And just for the record, when you record 4K at 25 frames per second, I didn't get any problem with overheating on the X-T3 or the X-T4, they were absolutely fine. The X-T4 has the same autofocus system as the X-T3, with 117 points that cover most of the sensor surface. These points can become 425 depending on the settings used. The X-T4 has a new algorithm that, in addition to distance, also analyzes shape and data to improve tracking. It kind of reminds me of the real-time tracking that you find on Sony cameras, although I find that one to be faster and more reliable overall. Fujifilm says that the success rate should be twice more efficient on the X-T4, and also the minimum sensitivity in low light has improved. It's 6 stops instead of 3 stops on the X-T3. Fujifilm also claims a locking speed of 0.02 seconds, which is the same Sony claims for the 6600. The X-T4 feels a bit faster in single AF, albeit not by a long margin. And also remember that the focusing speed depends on the lens you're using as well. For example, one of my favorite Fujifilm lenses is the 35mm 1.4, but this is also one of the first lenses that Fuji produced for when it launched the X series, and the autofocus motor of this lens is slower than other lenses like the 35mm f2 version. In low light, I haven't noticed any difference, despite the claimed higher sensitivity on the X-T4. Even when having the two cameras side by side and the subject walking towards me in a dark room, the keeper rate was almost identical. One improvement I found is when using the wide tracking mode, which works on the entire area of the sensor. I rarely used it on previous Fujifilm cameras because it often proved unreliable, with the focus point jumping to something else than the subject. With the X-T4, I found wide tracking to work better because the camera has improved the way it understands what and where the subject is. To test face and eye detection, I asked my subject to do different movements such as walking straight to and from the camera, walking and turning 360 degrees, and zigzagging. First, what emerged is that the X-T4 has a better keeper rate, meaning that focus is more accurate and fast. The amount of autofocus shots were approximately 20% less than on the X-T3. In the test where the subject turned around, the X-T4 was more precise in keeping the subject in focus at all times, even when the face wasn't visible. The X-T3 was more prompt to miss focus on the background as soon as the head disappeared. That being said, the X-T4 is not perfect either. For example, if the subject is wearing glasses, there is a tendency of preferring the nose or the glasses frame rather than the eyes. And even without glasses, both cameras can miss the eyes at close focus distances. Another thing is that the cameras can detect faces where there are none. This is something I've seen on Fuji cameras since the beginning, and it's still pretty much there 4 generations after. So this behavior, or seeing a face where there are none, can happen a lot. So if I'm not shooting portraits, I tend to disable face and eye detection, and I assign face and eye detection to a function button so I can activate or deactivate it quickly. I also tested the cameras for birds in flight, which is one of my main autofocus tests. I saw an improvement over the X-T3 when it comes to precision and keeper rate, although it's not a huge improvement, and just like the X-T3, you need to carefully select the right settings, including the continuous shooting speed and the EVF custom settings. The X-T4 is a good camera for sports and action in general because it also has excellent continuous shooting speed. You can go up to 15 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, or up to 20 frames per second and 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. At 30 frames per second there is a 1.25 times crop, but still it's a very good speed. And what's even more interesting is that with the electronic shutter you get live view and no blackouts. That is something you will also find on the X-T3 and the X-Pro 3 and the X-T30, and the other two cameras that are capable of doing this are the Sony A9 and the A9 Mark II. I'm going to stop here, however, concerning autofocus and birds in flight, because we have a dedicated video on our YouTube channel about how the camera performs, and it's also a tutorial with all the settings for autofocus and continuous shooting speed explained. So even if you're not interested in birds, you can still learn how the settings works, and so I'll leave the link as usual in the cards or in the description below. In video mode there are less EVF settings, only single point or multi, but I found multi more reliable on the X-T4 than on the X-T3. You can control the speed and responsiveness with the EVF custom setting, where you find the tracking sensitivity and AF speed. You can set this to have the AF as fast and reliable as possible, like when tracking a bird, or you can tweak them to make slow and smooth focus transitions between 2 points in your shot. Concerning face and eye detection, surprisingly the X-T4 gave me a slightly worse performance than the X-T3. When moving quickly towards the camera, it pumped back and forth after I stopped in front of it, a behavior the X-T3 did not have. First I thought I was getting too close and reaching the minimum focus distance of the lens, but I tested this multiple times and always got the same behavior. When the subject turns around, both cameras are able to maintain focus on the body, but the performance is not constant and I got errors on both products a few times. Like for still, both cameras have the annoyance of finding a face where there isn't any. Up until recently, Fujifilm had produced only one APC camera with in-body stabilization, the X-H1. At the time, the argument for the bigger body of the X-H1 was to get the space needed to accommodate the sensor shift unit. Less than 2 years later, Fujifilm designed a smaller and lighter unit that could fit in the X-T4, and the company says to have also improved the performance in comparison to the X-H1. The IBIS works on 5 axes: roll, pitch, yaw, X, and Y. The system can compensate up to 6.5 stops with a good number of Fujinon XF lenses, whereas others are between 6, 5.5 or 5 stops of compensation. The IBIS unit on the X-T4 can work with non-stabilized lenses or lenses with optical stabilization. If you have a lens with optical stabilization, the camera uses 3 axes on the sensor, which is roll, X and Y, and then the 2 axes on the lens, which is pitch and yaw. I think the only exception to this is the 80mm 2.8 macro, which has a more advanced stabilization system with 4 axes. So in that case, pitch, yaw, X and Y are on the lens, and then the remaining roll axis is on the camera body. I was curious to see how the camera would perform with lenses with optical stabilization, lenses without optical stabilization, long focal length and short focal length, so I tested all that. First, with wide-angle lenses, I managed to get a few decent results with the X-T4 at 1 second. However, if you want perfect sharpness and a decent keeper rate of 60–70%, you should not go slower than 1/4 of a second. I didn't find real differences when having optical stabilization instead of just sensor stabilization. The results were very similar. With a telephoto lens, you can get something decent at 1/4 of a second, but you should stay above 1/8 of a second for a better keeper rate. What came out from these results is that the X-T4 performance is not that different really from the X-H1 that I tested 2 years earlier. So despite the improved specs on paper, the performance is about the same. Also, if you use a lens with optical stabilization on a non-stabilized body, you're gonna get more or less the same result. Here is an example with the 18 to 135mm f3.5 5.6 that gave me a decent photo around half a second when used on the older X-T2. For video you have extra settings. The first one is called DIS, which is Digital Image Stabilization, and it improves the performance by adding electronic stabilization on top of what the hardware does. The catch is that the field of view is cropped by approximately 1.1 times. The other setting is called IS Boost and is designed to improve static shots, so without movements. When I tested the X-T4 in May, I found it to have a lot of jerks when panning, as well as a bit of jittering with static shots. In the meantime, Fujifilm released firmware 1.02 to fix these issues. Indeed, the jerks, although not completely gone, are more subtle, and if you're careful when you're starting your movement, you can avoid them. The jittering is also reduced with static shots, but not completely gone. Digital stabilization can help at times, but in others it doesn't make a relevant difference, and it's a bit unclear when to use it and when to avoid it. I found it to be a bit inconsistent. In my tests, I found that IS Boost can help with more than just static shots. It can be a bit unpredictable, but it can also reduce the amount of shakes with complex movements. My advice is to do some tests of your own to see which setting you prefer. Overall, the performance of the X-T4 is not bad. It's not the best in the market, but now that the firmware has reduced the amount of jerks, you can get better results. The footage won't be perfectly stable, but it can definitely look good enough if you don't have the chance of using an external stabilizer or a tripod. If you want to know more, there is another video on our YouTube channel that compares the X-T4 with the best-in-class EM1 Mark III. The X-T4 has other features that I'm not going to cover because this video is already long as it is, but you have lots of bracketing options, including focus bracketing, for example. There is USB tethering, the panorama mode, etc, etc. You can also use the X-T4 as a webcam with the USB-C connection and the software from Fujifilm, the X Webcam software. And I tried it a couple of times for Zoom calls and Skype, and it works quite well. And with version 2 of the software, you can also control some settings from the computer, like for example the film simulation mode. The quality is not fantastic because the resolution doesn't seem to be very high and there's no way to control that in the software, or at least not yet. But overall it does the job and it's a nice extra thing to have. And speaking of updates, Fujifilm is known to be a company that releases a lot of firmware updates for its cameras over the years, so it is likely that X-T4 will receive new features, new settings, and even maybe some fix in the future. And at the time of publishing this video, I had firmware 1.10, which is the latest available when recording the video. One thing I can briefly mention that I don't like on the X-T4 and other Fuji cameras is the Wi-Fi connection with the smartphone and the mobile application. I find it too erratic. Sometimes it disconnects without reason. Sometimes you have to turn on and off everything to make it work again. So it's not very stable. It can be very slow as well. So, I hope they will be able to improve this with updates on the app, the mobile app, and also on the cameras. So to conclude, I think the X-T4 is a very, very good camera. It excels on almost every department. In some key areas like video, it does better than most of its competitors. And overall, it's an excellent product for still photographers, but also filmmakers. And for the price you pay, I don't think there is anything better at the moment on the market. Of course, there are things that can still be improved. For example, the autofocus, it still has its quirks, especially when it comes to face and eye detection. And the stabilization, hasn't really improved from the X-H1 that was released 2 years ago. Although this is the first camera in the X-T series to have stabilization, so it's still an improvement because now there are more Fujifilm cameras with stabilization than before. The last thing I want to mention is the X-T3. I talked about it throughout this video, and at the time of publishing this review, you can find the X-T3 for a very good price. And the difference with the X-T4 is significant, which begs the question, is the X-T4 worth the extra money? Well, consider this. I think there are three main advantages to get an X-T4 over the X-T3. The first one is, of course, the image stabilization that works with any lens. The second one is the larger battery that gives you a much better battery life. And then we have the multi-angle LCD screen. So you need to understand this, one of these three things, or the three things, are a must-have for your shooting needs or not. And of course, with the X-T3, you pay less. So with that money you spared, you can buy a new lens, you can buy an accessory, or you can just keep it in your bank account. Well, I guess that's it for this review. Of course, if you have any question, as usual, don't hesitate to leave a comment and I'll try to answer as soon as possible. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.